It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 64. Hello, everyone. This is It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to professional wrestling history from 1870 to 1930. And my name is Ken Zimmerman Jr. This week, it will be a solo episode, and I've already re-recorded the opening about 5 times because I thought every one of them sucked. So I'm hoping that this one is much better this time around. My cousin Dan will be back in studio within the next 2 weeks, and I know this because we're not waiting for approval anymore. We're breaking him out, and he's going to come home in about 10 days. So I look forward to having him back in the studio. We are going to go to a weekly format. So starting this week, we will have an episode released each week. Next week, I will probably have my son Caleb with me for that episode. And then it should be Dan and I going forward with occasional visits by my son Caleb, my son Trey. And I'm hoping to have the grandsons back in the studio here before the year is out. With the weekly format, we will not be able to do, well, there'll always be some history in there because I can't stop myself. But every single episode will not be jam-packed with history with a certain theme. We will occasionally do review episodes like Dan and I have done in the past for 350 days. And we are going to review Iron Claw. I know that we've already talked about reviewing that in either October or November. So occasionally we may branch off and do a review. We will not probably review very much modern wrestling. We might review a card from the 80s or 90s or 50s for that matter. But I don't see us doing a modern card unless it's to watch a few matches with Trey and Caleb to get their perspective. Not being traditional wrestling fans, the listeners have tended to like their feedback on the wrestling matches. They did not watch wrestling growing up. They did watch MMA, and they both started Taekwondo when they were each 5. Trey actually was 2 weeks before his 5th birthday. And they started Judo, Trey at 8 and Caleb at 6. So lots of experience in martial arts. Very little experience watching pro wrestling. They just started, like I quit watching wrestling back in the 2000s. I just started watching again because of writing about wrestling, and I knew I was going to do the podcast after I was interviewed on the Martial Culture podcast back in 2021. They never watched wrestling growing up, so they have no frame of reference for it. And I told Trey and Caleb, I can't recreate the atmosphere that I grew up in watching wrestling because that world doesn't exist anymore. You can watch just about everything they still have recorded on the internet, whereas when I was growing up, you had your local promotion, which normally had a local television show, and that was the only wrestling you saw. If you saw wrestling from somewhere else, you were either on vacation, when VHS became a thing, someone was sending you a tape, or you visited family that had cable in the late 70s. I don't want to go over a lot of news this time around because I'm hoping to go into fairly in-depth with Dan a lot of the news that's been going on for the past couple of months because he always has interesting perspectives on that. I did want to report that it came out this week that AEW looks like they're going to get a rights renewal from Warner Brother Discoveries in the range of $170 million a year for 3 years with an option for a 4th year, which is a good thing for the company. And it has several things that are going to be a benefit for this business to try and grow. One of the first things is they probably now will be able to stream their ROH library and the AEW library through one of the streaming, whether it's Max or another one of the streaming channels within that WB Discovery group of channels. They'll have the ability now to get their library out, which will be an opportunity to gather new fans. The other thing is they might have some partnership on the pay-per-view side, either premium live events like the WWE does, or a partnership with maybe a Max in the pay-per-view business like UFC has with ESPN and ESPN Plus. That would also be a big benefit. The downside I see with this is I think they've got 3 years to prove themselves, or maybe the next renewal is flat or not as good, because they have been losing viewers at an astonishing rate. They've lost from 2021 a peak, of 1 million, 1.5 million, to now their big numbers are in the 800,000s, and they've had several weeks where they've been down around 500,000 people watching. They're losing fans, not gaining fans, and they're going to have to reverse that trend. And part of it is the creative. A lot of it is the management and having too many wrestlers and you never see them, and then all of a sudden they come out of nowhere for a couple weeks and then they're gone again. Tony Khan really needs to quit being a mile wide and an inch deep and figure out who his stars are, figure out who his company should be, and not just because they have a title, who could grow his business. I've said many times, Buddy Matthews has tons of untapped potential, but he's lost in a group right now. You have to see, who could I build, who could I do something with, and then what's my plan. And if your big event every year is going to be Wembley, and I don't even think they should be running Wembley Stadium starting next year, because again, they need to look for smaller buildings that they can fill instead of huge buildings that they can only half fill or a quarter fill. But whatever your big event is going to be, whatever you deem that to be, in WWE it's really easy, it's WrestleMania, and then you've got a couple big events through the year you want to be building stuff to, but everything culminates in WrestleMania. So what is that year-long story arc going to be? Do that first, and then you can build all the other pieces around it. You have mini episodes, however you want to look at it. If you're of the showbiz mindset, you're looking at it as episodes. If you're in the wrestling mindset, you're looking at it as feuds and championship matches, etc. I think this is a great opportunity for them. I hope they don't blow it. And I've said before, I'm not going to watch an AEW pay-per-view until they're 3 hours long and they quit junking up the card with a bunch of 10 people matches, 20 people matches, other than to give somebody a paycheck. That's not attracting fans. There's too much going on for people to catch up with, and you're burning people out. But it's just not AEW. I wasn't watching WWE when they were doing these 5 hours extravaganzas, and extravaganza I'm saying with a small e. You just burn your audience out. There's too much, there's too much is not great. More is not better. More is more. More is not always a good thing. And UFC has hurt themselves by having too many events and too many people nobody cares about. And you're seeing the same thing in wrestling. Too long of events, too many events, and a bunch of people nobody cares about. You got to figure out who people are going to care about and start booking and pushing them. And there's tons of other things that they could do to better themselves, but I doubt they're going to do those. So if you just start there, that would help. The next book project I have not even started yet. I will probably get that off the ground in October. And I do not think that I will be able to get another book out this year. So that's Shooter in a Work World, John Pesek in the 1920s Promotional Wars. will be the last book I think I publish for this year. It is available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, hardback, and audiobook. So any of those formats, it's available on Amazon. It'll probably be a few months yet for it's available for bookstores, but stay tuned. The history topic for this week's episode is the person I believe that is the first St. Louis-based professional wrestler. There was wrestling in St. Louis before this wrestler, but I think those were all people coming into town like Evan Strangler Lewis and wrestling a match. You might have had a local wrestler that was on that card but never really made a name for themselves. The first wrestler from St. Louis that I know of that developed a reputation where people knew who he was is a middleweight wrestler by the name of George Baptiste. And George Baptiste was a 5'6", 165-pound Greco-Roman wrestling specialist, but he did wrestle quite a few catch-as-catch-can wrestling matches. And one of the catch-as-catch-can tournaments held in Detroit in 1891, Baptiste registered as the middleweight entrant into the middleweight tournament. They had several divisions. He entered both middleweight and heavyweight, but I don't think he ever competed in the heavyweight because he won the middleweight division at this Detroit wrestling tournament in 1891. And winning that tournament, the results were published nationally, and Baptiste became known as nationally as a very good middleweight pro wrestler. And this was back when lightweights and middleweights did wrestle professionally. Most did not achieve the level of fame or financial success that the heavyweights and the light heavyweights did. But lightweights and middleweights were frequently on cards, and maybe not the main event, but the co-main event. And Baptiste was a very good middleweight wrestler. He claimed the middleweight world championship, but that was more of a bragging rights thing. It wasn't an actual championship. And his claim to it was rather dubious. And Baptiste was a good wrestler. He was not a great wrestler. So he never challenged he challenged, but he never won. He challenged the American Heavyweight Wrestling Champion, and he lost. He challenged others. And he wrestled the most dominant wrestler outside of the United States in 1905. Georg Hackenschmidt, the world champion, he had been world champion for 5 years. He came to St. Louis in 1905. And one of the reasons Baptiste was not a great wrestler is his attention was divided between his wrestling career and his father's business, which he would one day run, and which he was an integral part of from the very beginning, Baptiste Tent and Awning Company. So Alexander Baptiste, his father, was a physical culturist of note. And physical culture is what they called weight training, bodybuilding, physical fitness before they started calling it physical fitness. And Baptiste's father lifted weights, did gymnastics, and swam, which are all things that George Baptiste would do as he got older. And Alexander Baptiste would wake up in the morning, work out for half an hour, eat his breakfast, and then walk the 3.5 miles from his house on Page to his office downtown. And then at the end of the day, he would walk back home. And he was doing this all the way up until he was 100 years old. He passed away at 100, and he was still doing this daily routine every day, even when he was 100 years old. Which his level of fitness would come in, Alexander, not George. Alexander's level of fitness would come in very handy in 1914 in another story we're going to tell. But George is going to wrestle the world champion Georg Hackenschmidt. And Georg Hackenschmidt actually writes about this in his book, How to Live in Health and Strength. Then the last, I don't know, well, not even the last, more of that book is about his life story. The first half of that book, and I'll put a link in it in the show notes at kenzermanjr.com, episode 64. He told the story of his life, and a lot of it revolved around his wrestling career, Hackenschmidt. And he talked about coming to St. Louis. He got sick with the flu when he arrived in St. Louis, and his temperature was like 102 degrees. And he was going to call off the he was going to call off the wrestling match. But he heard George Baptiste in the other room not wanting to go into the ring with Hackenschmidt, and the promoters basically begging and pleading with him not to back out, because Baptiste is the most famous wrestler in St. Louis. If he backs out, the fans will want their money back. So they convinced him to go into the match with Hackenschmidt, but Hackenschmidt was so amused by the conversation in the other room trying to get Baptiste to go out there that it kind of revived him a little bit, and he decided not to call off the match, and he went out there and beat Baptiste pretty easily, which is not surprising at all when you're the current touring world champion and you are 5'9", 210 pounds, and recognized as the world's strongest man. Besides his wrestling accomplishments, and actually even before he started wrestling professionally or amateur, Hackenschmidt had started lifting weights as a teenager, and by the time he was 19, he held several weightlifting world records and was considered the strongest man in the world. Baptiste is 5'6", 165 pounds, a physical fitness enthusiast, but nowhere near the strength or the wrestling level of Georg Hackenschmidt. So it wasn't lack of courage that Baptiste was displaying, it was good sense. But they did a drawing, which I'll probably put in the show notes as well. They did a drawing in one of the local papers of basically Hackenschmidt being this giant and Baptiste being this small little guy, and Hackenschmidt basically playing with him before he beat him. Baptiste has this successful but part-time wrestling career from the 1890s to the 1900s, and he's also training wrestlers. So another wrestler who got his start in St. Louis early on was Oscar Wasem, W-A-S-E-M. And Wasem was good enough that he beat Frank Gotch in a legitimate contest in like 1901. Now, Gotch would have beat him, and I think did beat him later on. But Wasem caught Gotch when he was young and inexperienced and actually got a win over him. Baptiste helped train Wasem, and he helped train a lot of other wrestlers too. Because the wrestling was always kind of a part-time, today we'd call it a side hustle. That's not what it was called back then, but it was part-time because his full-time focus was the Baptiste Tent and Awning Company, which his father Alexander had formed. So through the 1890s and 1900s, while he is a wrestler himself, he's also training other wrestlers and serving as their second and their coach. Well, in the 19-teens, at this point in time, he is 40. Well, he was 37 in 1900. So, but, you know, the mid-19, when he goes into the ring with Hackenschmidt, he's 42. And his in-ring career is pretty much nearly over. So, in the 19-teens, he's still involved with the local wrestling scene, but there's not much going on. But in the early 1920s, there are a couple of wrestling matches that occur professionally, and he shows up and is the referee. And then when John, and it was actually, there was another promoter, William Wellman, I may be confusing that with the name of the film director of the same name. But it was William something. I think it might have been Wellman. No relation to the film director. He has a couple of cards in December of 21 and early 1922 at the Odeon Theater. And Baptiste, who is in his late 40s, is the referee for many of these cards. And then at some point in 1922, Contos takes over the promotion in St. Louis, and he frequently uses Baptiste as his referee. And John Contos' nephew is Tom Pax, who would become the longtime St. Louis promoter. And outside of Sam Muchnick, when people think of St. Louis promotion, there's only two names that would come up. Tom Pax from the 20s into the 40s, and then Sam Muchnick from the 40s into January 1st, 1982. Contos takes over. He uses Baptiste regularly. In fact, to a point where the second Zbyszko Ed Strangler Lewis match in St. Louis in December of 1922. So a little quick history. In late 1920, Stanislaus Zbyszko, who's been a prisoner of war in Germany and Russia, I believe, Russia initially and then Germany, he's released from the prison camps after World War I. And I know Germany and Russia weren't allied. It's a weird. He was a Polish officer, and he ran afoul of the Bolsheviks. And when there was some kind of rapprochement between Germany and Russia, the Russians let the Germans have him, and he was in a German prisoner of war camp for a while. He meets a senator over in Europe who is interested in Polish war relief, and Zbyszko agrees to wrestle a couple charity cards in Europe, and this senator helps him get back to the United States. So in late 1920, he arrives back in the United States, which he has not been in since 1914 when he left. He campaigned in the United States for a match against Frank Gotch. He had one match. He wanted a rematch and never got one from 1909 to 1914. He comes back into the country. He gets hooked up with the Jack Curley promotional group, and they decide that they want to take the belt off Lewis for a little bit to cool off the headlock. And so Zbyszko beats him. And Zbyszko holds the championship from, I think, May of 21 until March of 22. And in March of 22, Zbyszko drops the belt back to Lewis. But Lewis was always concerned about Zbyszko trying to double cross, because he said the only two people that might beat him in a legitimate contest, Lewis is saying this, is his training partner, Joseph Toots Mott, or Stanislaus Zbyszko. Those are the only two he thinks might be able to beat him. So when they have the return match in December of 1922 in St. Louis between Zbyszko and Lewis and Billy Sandow, Lewis's manager, are both worried about this potential double cross could be coming. And they start arguing over the referee. And at first they weren't going to use George Baptiste because they didn't know who he was as far as the referee goes and everything. But John Contos convinces them to use Baptiste as referee, and that is who they use for that match, because he says he's wealthy already. He owns his own tent and awning company here in town, and he's a very successful businessman. He's not going to be tempted. If somebody tries to bribe him, he's got more money than they do. He's not going to be bribed. And that's why they accepted George Baptiste. And the match went according to plan. There were no issues, and Baptiste, of course, wasn't going to take any payoffs. So Baptiste is the main referee in St. Louis throughout the 20s, but now he's getting into his 60s. Even the refereeing, even though he's still in fantastic shape, they're using other people besides Baptiste, because in that day and age, a 60-year-old person, you didn't know when they were going to pass, even though his dad had lived to be 100 and his grandfather had lived to be 115. So they started working other referees in. So he was still a referee, but he wasn't the main referee. That is pretty much Baptiste's wrestling career. You know, a few high points, mostly a part-time wrestler. Probably more famous as St. Louis's main referee in the 20s and as a local businessman. One of the other things that was part of George Baptiste's legacy was he was very unlucky in love. So he was a bachelor until his mid-30s, and he had met this young girl in Milford, Connecticut. Now, Baptiste was a very strong swimmer, and he had saved several people from drowning in the Mississippi River, including a priest, on one of the holidays. And when he was vacationing up in Milford, Connecticut in 1895, two teenagers got caught up in, I don't know if it was a riptide, they just got caught up in some surfs. They swam out too far. But they were out and they started to drown. And Baptiste swam out, got the girl, and brought her back. I think it might have been a rough sea, because he brings her back, and the boy is even farther out than she was, and he's like, I'm going to get him. And they're like, you can't, you'll drown. And he went out anyway. And they lost sight of Baptiste and this boy and thought, oh, that they didn't make it. And about 15 minutes later, Baptiste comes out of the ocean carrying the kid. Both kids lived and would not have if he had not saved them from drowning. Well, on the beach that day is a 14-year-old girl and her family. And they were so impressed by this act of heroism that they invited Baptiste to stay with them when he vacationed in Milford, Connecticut, which he did. And when he's 35 and this girl is 18, she basically makes her feelings for him known. And at first he's thinking about the age difference and everything, but then he has a change of heart. He talks to the family and asks to marry her. They say yes. They get married. They have a honeymoon up in Milford, Connecticut, and then they move back to St. Louis. Her name was Nellie. Nellie is in St. Louis for less than a week, and she tells him, I can't be that far away from the ocean. I got to be back home. She had what we would call a severe case of homesickness. And George Baptiste, because he is an officer in the Baptiste Tent and Awning Company, and it's his dad's choice to be the successor as president and owner of the company, he says, I have to stay in St. Louis. The company's here. And she said, well, I can't. So she goes back home. He writes her a few letters, and when she's just not going to come back to St. Louis, he reluctantly files for divorce. Well, a few months go by, and then she sends him another letter saying, no, I'm gonna move to St. Louis. You're right. I need to be where you're at. You're my husband. So he drops the suit. He waits, and he waits, and he waits, and 14 months go by, and she doesn't come, and she keeps, putting off coming to St. Louis. And he finally goes and files for divorce again, and the divorce is granted in 1901. He does not have a serious relationship, I guess you would say, until the mid-19-teens. In 1914, he weds a lady named Nettie. So his first wife is Nellie, second wife is Nettie. And he and Nettie get off to a very rocky start from the very beginning. So I said Alexander Baptiste's father was in great shape, which came in very handy because George Baptiste's new wife says, we ought to have your dad, and his mother had passed away much younger, so Alexander married a second time, and he had children with his second wife, who were George Baptiste's half-brothers and sisters. They invite Alexander Baptiste, his second wife, and George's half-sister, who he's very close with, over for dinner one night. And Nettie says, we don't have ice cream. Would you go get some ice cream? And George says, sure. So he goes out to get ice cream. He comes back home, and Nettie is chasing his father around the front yard with a butcher knife. Now, I don't know how most people would react to it, but my dad was only in his 70s, and if I had come home and saw my significant other chasing my 70-year-old father around the front yard, I think domestic relations would have been diminished very, very quickly. And I might have thought to myself, maybe I made a bad choice here. He was in great condition, but he's 95 years old running around the front yard being chased by someone with a butcher knife. This is not fun and games here. He doesn't split up with her. They stay married for 6 years. And in 1920, she files for divorce from him. Now, they separated in April of 1919. And they're living in separate places, but she doesn't file for divorce. In 1919, Alexander passes away at 100 years old in September 1919. And George is now the president and owner of the Tent and Awning Company. 1920, Nettie files for divorce, and some of the things she alleges is that he refused to hire help around the house for her. He was mean and called her names, and that he would wrestle with her when she didn't want to be wrestled. And Baptiste testified that, yes, I did restrain her, but that's only because she was a pugilist of some note, and when she got mad, the fists would be flying. It's hard to say in these situations who's telling the truth. Usually the truth is somewhere in the middle of all of that. The court sides with Nettie and gives her $10,000, which is a lot of money in 1921, but when he dies in 1938, George Baptiste's net worth is about $200,000. So $10,000 is a lot, but it was probably a tenth of what his worth was at the time she got a divorce from him. And her attorneys had to sue her the following year for their fees. She got $10,000. They were supposed to get $2,000 of the $10,000, and they had to sue her to get it. But it was just a mess. And of course, all of this comes out in the newspaper with all of these tantalizing details and leads him to be sort of a figure of ridicule for a while. So Baptiste is kind of off marriage after his first two forays into it. But he's not off domestic relations, and he meets a lady named Lillian in the late 1920s, not late 19 teens, late 1920s. There's about a 25-year age difference between the two of them, but they lived together as man and wife for 10 years. He introduces people to her as his wife, but they are not married. They never have gotten married. Missouri is not a common law state. So Some states, if you live together with someone for 7 years, you're married. Missouri is not one of those states. However, in 1938, Baptiste is 74 years old and he's diagnosed with stomach cancer. He puts up a valiant fight, but on December 1st, 1938, he succumbs to stomach cancer. But before he died, he married Lillian 5 days before his death. That became the point of contention for some of his relatives who were left out of the will and decided to sue Lillian and try to nullify the will. Initially, Lillian was taken care of in the will to the tune of about $5,000 or $10,000 a year. However, because she had married him and she was the widow, she was entitled to half under Missouri law, half of his estate. But his will left out most of the offspring of his brothers and full brothers. So it wasn't just his half-siblings. The only person that he provided for outside of Lillian in that will was his niece. And his niece was actually supposed to inherit the majority of it, but she ended up getting half, and Lillian ended up getting half. The niece never contested the will. She said that that was what her uncle wanted, and that he was mentally acute up until the end. The doctors also testified to the same thing. But it took over 2 years for all of this to wind through the court, where the estate was basically held up for 2 to 2.5 years before it was finally settled. The court ruled in the favor of Lillian and the niece and the nephews, and I think 2 of the half-brothers. They did not inherit anything. But they tried to get the will nullified, saying he wasn't in his right mind when he married Lillian and made the will and didn't include them. While Lillian was portrayed by the brothers and the nephew throughout, as the niece did not, but was portrayed as like a fortune hunter in that, she never remarried. She outlived Baptiste by 34 years, and she never remarried. She died in 1972, and she was still a widow to Baptiste. She never remarried. So you can make your own call whether you think that she was a fortune hunter or not. I personally don't. Family dynamics sometimes are odd, and if they lived together as man and wife for 10 years before he passed away, she was entitled to be treated like the wife. And so he must have felt the same way, and that's why he married her 5 days before he died, to make sure that she was taken care of. So that is the story of George Baptiste. I don't really have a review for this week. I've been watching a lot of the Mid-South Wrestling from 1985, and I have to say, after that really hot run in 1984, it kind of got bad quick in 1985. I'm not saying anything against him, because in the ring he was a tremendous worker, but they put the North American title on Brad Armstrong in 1985. And Brad Armstrong just did not have the kind of charisma to make people care about him. Not even like him. I think the fans liked him fine. It's just they didn't care that much about him. Like, the fans cared about Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson. The fans never really cared about Brad Armstrong. If he won, yeah, great. If he lost, he didn't have in the ring, the kind of charisma that made people care. They said out of the ring, he was hilarious, and if he could have shown any of that in his performance in the ring, that he would have been a big star, because he was a great worker. But that's what a lot of people make the point when they talk about AEW is always talking about, we have great matches. But if those matches don't tell great stories and you don't have people that anybody cares about, Nobody cares that somebody went out there and did a bunch of moves. It's just nobody cares about him. That's why CM Punk was the biggest star they had ever had, because CM Punk makes you care one way or the other. He'll make you love him or he'll make you hate him, but you care. And the biggest stars, Roman Reigns, makes you care. Whether you hate him as a tribal chief or you love him as a tribal chief, he makes you care. He comes across as a big star. And so, yeah, his match probably is not as exhilarating as Dynamite Kid versus Tiger Mask. But he's drawing a lot of money. And there are a lot of people that want to watch his matches and the things he's doing. So it doesn't matter that he doesn't have the greatest 8-star match ever had. He has very believable matches that people enjoy watching for something that matters. So if you want to check something out and watch it, I recommend. And they have these on YouTube as well. You can just search out Mid-South Wrestling from 1985. And I think you're going to see that the product starts going down after that peak in 1984. Maybe Watts was burned out. I'm sure Vince is signing up all the talent he possibly could, was being felt by all the promoters, and that's probably what you're seeing here. But it didn't take Vince long. That war was over pretty quick, and outside of Jim Crockett Promotions, there wasn't really anybody that had a chance to put on anything that was going to give Vince any real competition. So until next week, where we will discuss some other topic, and I'll be joined in the studio by Caleb, I'm sure, for this upcoming one. Maybe we'll get Trey. And Trey is loath to give up his career as a mute, so getting him in the studio is not always the easiest thing in the world. Caleb likes to talk, so it's a lot easier to get him in. And Dan absolutely loves to talk. The challenge with him is getting him to shut up for 5 minutes. So I will obviously be frustrated, but I'm sure the listeners will be a lot happier when he gets back. Until next time, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.